Hi, my dear so family. Today we are going to be looking at the upcoming Saturn and Pluto sextile. And this is a very important sextile. Do not underestimate it for a second. And it really feels like the 2020 is about to be repeating. Of course, I'm not necessarily referring to COVID, but I'm going to be shedding light on why I think 2020 is going to get repeated. So I highly recommend staying to the very end of the video because, of course, you can learn a lot what to expect from the upcoming period of time. Obviously, what I'm going to be talking to you about is not a day transit, okay? So at least it's going to be valid for about 4 years because the sextile period is going to last for about 4 years until the next square is going to be happening. So what I want to show you here is, by the way, I've broken this down for all 12 signs as well. So therefore, I'm not going to be doing that. Okay. So you might want to be just listening to the weekly energy patterns so that you exactly aware of what is happening. So here is the chart when the actual sextile is happening. So you can see that Pluto is on 5 degree, and then you can see that Saturn is on 5 degree. So we have got a sextile there. But why it's so special? Because at the same time, Pluto and Ceres are in also square. And the reason why it's so important, Ceres is kind of like now furious. Why it's so important? Look at the initial conjunction that took place 2020 January. Pluto Saturn conjunction on 22 degree, and who is right next to them? Ceres. So we have got the exact constellation happening right now, but Ceres being on a rogue mission right now. So I'm going to be breaking this down for you. Let's just get going. Firstly, uh, the blueprint of Saturn and Pluto sextile is very strategic here. This is a very constructive, or it's meant to be a constructive, and you're gonna hear quite a lot of most likely positive things about the Saturn and Pluto sextile. A sextile is a 60-degree aspect. We have got the planet of discipline and the planet of transformation coming together, and it is giving us the opportunity to rebuild system with more of a precision, actually. So it really feels like that it's a controlled demolition of something. It's not necessarily about burning everything down. It's about identifying which old structures are blocking future progress and then removing them with kind of like a bit of a surgical intent. Remember, with Aries, we're cutting something away. We're cutting away a system, Saturn, that needs a major upgrading, and that's the Plutonian element. So this is a disciplined innovation type of archetype here. New ideas, Pluto in Aquarius, are kind of like given the backbone, the structure, the shape, and the form, the reality element of it. And this aspect is trying to make sure that things are not floating away, and we are using certain type of theories that actually works in the physical world. So that's the beauty part of it. Now, what's so frustrating is Ceres. Ceres, who is squaring Pluto and has got this semi-sextile to Saturn as well. So while Saturn and Pluto are working together, Ceres, which represents nourishment, resources, the earth, it creates a hard aspect, a 90-degree aspect to Pluto. So this is a conflict here. What do we need to survive, and how power is being redistributed? That's the question here. That is, or how the gift of Earth is distributed among us. So imagine this as a community. Aquarius is trying to transition into, let's say, a digital automated infrastructure, which is Pluto in Aquarius. But this shift threatens the local food supply or the land ownership and so forth. All those topics are very series related. Series is also the growing pain. And the growing pain is connected to sustainability now. So it can represent certain type of a fear that by embracing this type of future, we might lose our connection to the physical basics, such as money, food, and comfort. So because it's a square, it does force a negotiation. It says we cannot have that new age of Aquarius if we neglect the physical foundation of Taurus. So this is a struggle over who controls the most vital resources during a time of this massive technological shift. All these planets are on 5 degrees. So, on one hand, we have that Saturn Pluto sextile, which offers us the discipline to modernize our lives and cut away this fat of the outdated habits. It's a green light for a reform. However, that Sirius Pluto square acts as a cautionary check. It reminds us that any progress made in this social sphere must be reconciled with our physical needs and our financial security as well. So the challenge is that we have to be innovating something without sacrificing the very things that keep us grounded and nourished. Now, of course, the plant or the seeds got planted back in 2020, January 12th. That's when the triple conjunction between Saturn, Pluto, and Ceres happened. And, everyone was focused on the Saturn Pluto great reset in Capricorn. And I think Ceres got a little bit ignored there. And Ceres represents the global resources, sustainability. That's the great mother archetype, the nature and the nurture element as well. But of course, that conjunction took place in the sign of Capricorn. So that is. And by the way, as you could see, the sun was sitting there also. What's so important is that the sun is also with Saturn right now. So this chart is really pretty much exactly the same like we had back in 2020. At that time, we did have the South Node also in the sign of Capricorn. We don't have it right now, and the South Node is not necessarily playing a significant role right now. Okay. What was also very special back in 2020, both Saturn and Pluto were also on their own South Node as well, which definitely emphasizing a massive karmic clearing of all its structures. So, in case you don't know, but each planet has got their South Node and North Node also. So, Pluto and Saturn South Node is somewhere around 22 degrees of Capricorn. So that conjunction, which took place between Saturn and Pluto, it lasts for about 34 years. And it's a very intense pressure and the implosion of systems. And then Ceres, being the part of it, it was a total merger of power and resources, and there was a hard focus on global health and food security, food supply, and so forth. And of course, Capricorn is government, tradition, corporation, kind of like the top-down control. So 2020 seemed like a total system shutdown with Ceres, Saturn, and Pluto together in Capricorn. We saw the literal freezing of global movement and the sudden forced reevaluation of how we nurture ourselves, under government restrictions. That's very Saturnian topic, right? And then currently, we aren't in a shutdown anymore. We are kind of like in a messy process of making this new system work. However, Saturn Pluto sextile gives us the tools to be brave, while the Sirius Pluto square reminds us that we can't eat innovation. We still need to figure out the bank accounts and the supply lines. Sorry about that. So 2020 conjunction was the seed of that initial crisis, and this sextile is the very first major opportunity to actually build something functional out of that kind of wreckage that we had. However, Ceres shifting from that conjunction to a square changes its role from the victim of the system to more of a blockage in the gears. So at that time, let me just give you an example. Back in 2020, we had the supply, but we didn't have toilet paper on the shelves. Okay. This time around, it feels like we have got the shops open, but we don't have the toilet paper to put it on the shelf. So that's the difference between the two key years here. In 2020, Ceres was trapped in Capricorn between Saturn and Pluto, symbolizing, the literal shutdown of nurturing, travel, and resources. But now in Taurus, Ceres is in its own element actually. Ceres loves being in Earth signs, especially in the sign of Taurus. So she has become very stubborn and very protective of its own territory. So I see a total loss of control here. Resources were forcibly restricted by the state and structures back in 2020. I think the topic there was survival and a great contraction. We had to learn how to live with less and redefine what was essential. Currently, it's a square, so that's a price tag problem here. We have the technology, we have the drive to move forward, but that physical cost, like the food prices, the land, or the old ways of making money, is kind of like fighting back. Ceres in Taurus wants to keep things the same, tangible, secure, while Pluto in Aquarius wants to digitize, automate, and decentralize things. So that's the tug of war here. And to get the benefit of that Saturn Pluto sextile, which is surely about a new system, we have to figure out how to pay for it or how to feed people in a way that the old Taurus system, would still accept in a way. I kind of imagine this the smart city and the local farmer type of conflict here. Let's say I'm a city and then I decide to implement this high-tech automated, kind of transit system to be more efficient. And it sounds, on one hand, a good move, right? But the local farmers or the landowners, that's Taurus, are furious because this new tech disrupts their land and changes the local economy they have relied on for decades. So while the sextile gives us a possibility, but it's getting slowed down, getting squared by this logistical and financial reality of the actual physical world. So I hope that makes sense. I mean, um, in 2020, I think the problem was very much connected to control. But in 2026, the problem is more inflation value. Um, so Ceres was conjunct Saturn and Pluto, so the assets were frozen. Supply chains stopped. Store shelves were empty. We couldn't get the toilet paper because the system broke down. It was about survival and the government telling you what was essential. Now, this time around, 2026 series is in Taurus. So this is about having the product, but the cost is the barrier, not at the empty shelves. So I'm expecting inflation to be a major topic in 2026, most likely in the next 4 years, actually. The rising cost of food, the friction of moving into this high-tech society, while the old world resources are kind of becoming harder and harder to maintain. In 2020, you had the money in your pocket most likely, but the store is locked and the bread is gone, because that series was trapped. Now the store is full and open. We've got all this smart food, genetically modified food, high-tech gadgets, but it costs 5 times more than it used to. And your bank account is kind of like transitioning to this new system which we are unsure whether to trust or not. Now, that's the series and the Pluto square. Another way I would like you to think about it from a mythological point of view, Pluto abducted the daughter of Ceres. So it indicates that Pluto is stealing something now from Ceres. Um, so how do I imagine that? In 2020, These three were locked together in the same room. They were forced to deal with each other directly. But 2026 in a square, which is often a friction, a crisis, an open argument because it's an opening square. So the argument is often open. So using the myth of the abduction of Persephone, the daughter of Ceres, it kind of talks to me about that 2020, we were all sitting in the same room. So that's when Pluto was able to pull the daughter, such as, the resources, the vitality, the growth, underground. Because we were all forced to go underground in our homes. The world was sitting kind of still, but Ceres had no choice but to endure the presence of Pluto and Saturn because we are in the same room. There was no argument yet, only kind of like the shock of that takeover. But now Ceres is fighting back. Ceres says, no, I don't think so. Ceres is kind of like now realizing that something was stolen from me. So Ceres decides that, yeah, I'm going to stop the harvest. So I'm going to refuse to let anything grow until she gets what she wants. She wanted to get her daughter back. So she's arguing with the king of the underworld for the return of her assets. So it's about resource withholding. It's about whether it is through inflation, supply chain strikes, or green regulations, but it's clashing with traditional farming because Ceres is putting her foot down right now. So let's kind of like try to make some predictions as a little bit of a summary. I think major disruption in the supply, the pricing of foundational resources, food, energy, or land. We're gonna expect that. Lands are not given back. Lands are stolen. Oil and all those type of stuff. We already see that anyway. I can definitely imagine a reboot of a major institution. Saturn in Aries is kind of like a little bit of a warrior architect here. He doesn't want to argue, it just wants to act. So, okay, if you don't give me the resources that I deserve, then I'm going to fight back. So, I'm expecting a high level leadership shift or the veiling of this new blueprint for a digital system, something that might have got seeded back in 2020. It's a controlled demolition of making business connections, but the old ways of making business connection is not happening. So it feels like that certain type of contractual agreements are going to be falling apart. You know, um, while Saturn Pluto says together, let's build it. Ceres Pluto square says you can't afford the materials anyway, so you cannot build that up. So surely that these are some of the topics that I would like to mention with this sextile. Of course, when you look at the current world, what has been happening. Um, just think of the Middle East. That has escalated into this resource withholding events already. Iran blocked the Hormuz, in response to the strikes and so forth. And this is a critical kind of choke point because the 25% of the world's oil, gas, and fertilizer come from there, right? So there is an abduction happening here, just like Pluto stealing Persephone. An invisible power has snatched away the world's nourishment, the fuel, the fertilizer. And not to mention that oil prices have surged past $100 already. Maybe it's around 117 and so forth. So the UN is already warning of a massive food security threat, which is Ceres in Taurus. So do I want to scare you of price changes? Absolutely. I think stock up your shelves, basically. Okay. That's what I can kind of like suggest for you. At the same time, of course, this could be really talking to us about financial matters as well. Uh, I think there's a massive structural push to finalize this digital plumbing, that's Saturn. Um, we are moving away from this traditional flat, um, like into these digital securities and the tokenization, which is so Pluto in Aquarius. Um, and Ceres is gonna go on strike. It really feels like it. So she is not going to allow whatever others are kind of like coming up. And just think of Ceres as the most basic biological needs. So I hope this helps to get a bit of a clearer understanding of what might be happening in the upcoming month. One thing that I would like to kind of remind you, we can look at the moon. When the moon is going to be triggering these degrees, especially by conjunction, and that's potentially when the headline could be um, coming up. I mean, one of the days could be 1st of April, because when the moon is going to be opposing that 5 degree there. Or when the moon is going to be in Scorpio, somewhere here, that's April 3rd. So that's highly possible. And I also can imagine somewhere here, April 10th, 11th, when the moon is going to be in Aquarius. I mentioned in the weekly forecast that the moon is going to go out of bound in the sign of Scorpio and it finishes its out of bound period in the sign of Aquarius. So basically, between 1st of April to 11th of April, I think we're going to get to know what exactly this series, Pluto, Saturn already indicates. Or the very latest is when the moon goes into, of course, the sign of Aries. So, but that's going to be happening around 15th of February, sorry, 15th of April. So between 1st of April to 15th of April, we're gonna get to know what it means. Do you let me know how you feel about this? Do you let me know if you think, I'm right, or what do you expect happening in the world? So take care, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.